I am here, standing in front of this microphone that seems to weigh tons in my hands, while the air conditioning of the Riyadh Convention Center hums in the background, trying to cool the electrical tension in the air. I see 10,000 faces fixed on me, a tide of white robes who have no idea that I am not who they think I am. The weight of another 5,000 people watching me live on the internet feels like physical pressure in my ears. I feel the brush of my expensive suit, a reminder of the farce I maintained to reach this moment in the heart of the kingdom that discarded me like trash. My fingers grip the metal so tightly that my knuckles ache. I can smell the Arabic coffee and the perfume of the investors, ignorant that I'm about to light a fuse that no one will be able to extinguish. It is a suspended moment where every beat of my heart echoes like a drum, reminding me that there is no turning back, that the exile is over, and that my true mission begins now, under these blinding lights. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. It is very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's get back to the testimony. 18 months ago, my reality was the cold floor of a bathroom in Jordan, where the smell of cheap disinfectant filled my lungs as I tried to let my life slip away. I was destined to be a forgotten corpse, an exiled prince who couldn't bear the weight of his defeat and sought the end in a bottle of pills. I remember the cold of the tiles and the darkness swallowing me, a solitude so deep that even my family's money couldn't buy a way out. But today, the contrast is violent. From that dark corner of Amman, I have moved to this illuminated stage, surrounded by the opulence that was once my world and that now seems so hollow to me. The difference isn't just the place, but the fire burning inside me, a warmth born when no hope remained, and that now pushes me to face the guards who are already moving toward me with suspicion. I am not the man who gave up. I am someone who died and was born again to testify that light pierces any wall, and that thought gives me a peace that makes me stop trembling. I took a deep breath before launching the words that would destroy what was left of my old life. "My name is not Abdullah al-Rashid," I said, and my voice resonated through the speakers with a strength that surprised me, causing the murmur of the crowd to die down. "My real name is Prince Khaled bin Abdulaziz Al Saud, and I am the half-brother of your king." There was a deathly silence, a vacuum of sound so dense that I could hear my own heavy breathing hitting the microphone. I saw fear and confusion on the faces of the officials in the front row, men I knew and who were now looking at me like a ghost. I continued without giving them time to react, speaking of my exile, my depression, and how, on the brink of death, Jesus Christ appeared to me to save my soul. Declaring that Jesus is the Son of God in this place, surrounded by the royal guard, felt like breaking an invisible chain that had kept me prisoner for 53 years of empty rituals and mechanical prayers that never reached heaven. What happened after my declaration was something no one in that room could have ever foreseen. I expected shouts of hatred, but a man in the center section stood up and shouted that he had seen him too. His voice was like the first crack of thunder, and suddenly from every corner, other people began to stand, breaking protocol in fear. "Jesus appeared to me too," shouted a woman, as chaos spread like a fire no one could control. What began as a boring business conference transformed in seconds into the largest public confession of Christian faith in the history of my country. I felt an electric shock realizing that I was not alone, that the King of Kings had already been working in the dreams of my people long before I stepped onto this stage. The guards grabbed me violently, but I could only smile, seeing how the truth was cracking the foundations of what I once considered immovable. I grew up surrounded by an opulence that most people only see in movies, but for me, it was simply the air I breathed. My father was King Abdulaziz, the founder of all this, and my childhood was spent among palaces that seemed like entire cities. I remember the constant smell of oud wood burning in the hallways and the feeling of cold marble under my bare feet, a coldness that somehow seeped into my bones. I had servants for every detail, luxury cars waiting for me before I even knew where I wanted to go, and private jets that took me all over the world. But inside me, there was a strange echo, a hole that none of that gold could fill. Sometimes I would stand staring at the fountains in the gardens, watching the water leap and fall endlessly, and I felt that my life was exactly like that, a cycle of external display without a real purpose. I was taught to be a leader, to walk with my chin held high and never show weakness, but no one taught me what to do with that loneliness that assaulted me in the midst of the most luxurious banquets. It was like living in a glass museum, where everything is perfect, but nothing has a pulse. and that lack of life haunted me even when I slept on sheets of the finest silk money could buy. The royal family is a giant labyrinth of factions, jealousies, and political maneuvers that consume you from the time you are just a child. We are thousands of princes and princesses, all connected by blood, but divided by the hunger for power and fierce competition for the favor of those at the top. My mother was not the king's favorite, and that meant I was in a strange position, close enough to the crown to desire it, but far enough away that I had to fight every inch to be noticed. I remember family gatherings as silent battlefields, where every smile hid a calculation and every kind word was a probe to detect weaknesses. I grew up seeing my brothers ally against each other, how influence was bought and sold in whispers behind heavy oak doors. That constant pressure to be the best, the most loyal, or the most useful hardens your heart in a way you don't even notice at first. You become a chess player before learning how to be a human being, and that survival mentality at the top leaves you exhausted, always looking over your shoulder, suspecting even those who share your own blood. There was no room for vulnerability. To be vulnerable was to be disposable, and I was determined that no one would ever discard me, even if it meant burying my true identity under layers of pride and political ambition. Religion was the concrete frame that held our entire social and personal structure. But for me, it was always a heavy and cold burden. From a very young age, I had private tutors who forced me to memorize large portions of the Quran in classical Arabic. And although the words sounded beautiful, they bounced off my mind without ever reaching my heart. I fulfilled the 5 daily prayers with military discipline, washing my hands and face ritually, bowing toward Mecca while reciting phrases that felt like ash in my mouth. During Ramadan, I fasted under the suffocating heat, feeling hunger and thirst, but the spirituality that was supposed to accompany the sacrifice simply wasn't there. I made the pilgrimage to Mecca several times, circling the Kaaba among crowds of people weeping with fervor, and I could only think about when the heat and exhaustion would end. I felt like a professional hypocrite, an actor playing the role of the perfect Muslim from the House of Saud, because that was what was expected of me, what maintained my status. But at the end of the day, when I was alone, the anguish returned with more force. I wondered if God was really that distant and demanding judge who only asked for blind obedience and mechanical rituals. That disconnection between my external acts and my internal emptiness made me feel like I was living a constant lie, one that was draining the life out of me drop by drop. The saddest part of living in that bubble of power was realizing that I wasn't the only one who felt that lost. I looked at my uncles and older brothers, men who managed billions and made decisions that affected the entire planet, and I saw in their eyes the same dull glint I felt in mine. Many filled that hole with excesses that religion strictly prohibited, but money allowed them to hide behind the walls of private mansions. I saw relatives fall into secret alcoholism, consuming expensive whiskeys in locked rooms to forget the pressure of their positions, or turning to drugs to endure the monotony of a life of empty luxuries. Others became cynical and cruel, using their power to humiliate those below them just to feel they had some kind of control over their own existence. It was a spectacle of decadence hidden under a facade of piety and righteousness that made me nauseous. No one spoke of it, of course. We kept the secret like a family pact of silence, smiling for official photos while our souls slowly withered. It terrified me to think that was my future, becoming a bitter man, dependent on hidden vices to endure the loneliness of a paper throne. That feeling of being trapped in an inevitable destiny made me search for something more, anything that had a trace of truth. But back then I had no idea that truth was not found in power, but in total surrender. When I reached my 20s, I received an official position in the Ministry of Defense. It was a position of extreme prestige that gave me control over billion-dollar military modernization contracts and connections with arms suppliers from around the world. I was good at what I did and earned the respect of high-ranking officials and influential tribal leaders. I began to build my own network of allies, tasting real power for the first time, and it was like a sweet poison spreading through my blood. I felt important, necessary, and above all, superior to others who did not have the same access as I did. Money flowed non-stop, but what I was really seeking was influence, the ability to shape the kingdom's future with a simple wave of my hand. I spent hours in strategic meetings, analyzing maps and budgets, feeling that I was finally stepping out of my brother's shadow. But deep down, all that rushing was just another desperate attempt to fill the void that still screamed inside my soul, a search for an identity the world could validate with titles. As I entered my 30s, the conviction that I deserved an even higher position in the government became an obsession that consumed my every thought. I looked at my half-brother, who would eventually become the current king, and felt a silent contempt, believing that I was much smarter, more capable, and better prepared than he would ever be. This arrogance grew inside me like a tumor, shaping all my decisions and making me view every interaction as an opportunity to gain political advantage. I no longer saw people as human beings, but as pieces on a board I needed to manipulate to reach the top. The idea that I could perhaps reach the throne itself began to seem not only possible, but necessary for my sense of self-worth. I spent sleepless nights planning secret conversations, cultivating loyalties, and nurturing a bitter resentment for being in a line of succession that kept me as only a supporting character. Power was no longer just a tool. It was my only hope of feeling that my life truly mattered in a world where everything seemed to be a facade. I began holding clandestine meetings with other disgruntled princes, trusted military commanders, and tribal leaders who felt the kingdom needed a new direction. I promised favors, offered guarantees of prosperity, and used all my influence in the ministry to strengthen these bonds of parallel loyalty. I believed I was being a brilliant strategist, a man of vision who was only fighting for what was legitimately his by right of competence. The tension between me and my half-brother grew every day, and although in public we were polite and respectful, in private we were rivals ready for the kill. I didn't plan a violent coup, but rather an internal political maneuver that would shift the balance of power in my favor at the right moment of succession. Pride blinded me to such an extent that I didn't realize the danger I was running by challenging the centuries-old structures of our family. I was willing to risk everything, including my safety and stability, to prove I was the best. Today I see that I was only digging a deep hole, driven by a pathological need for recognition that no earthly title would ever satisfy. Everything changed drastically when my half-brother consolidated his own power and was named Crown Prince, which officially placed him next in line for the throne. I felt the ground vanish beneath my feet, realizing that my window of opportunity was closing fast, and that if I didn't act soon, I would be permanently sidelined. I decided to accelerate my plans, pushing my allies to make firmer commitments for a direct challenge to the order of succession that had been established. I was in a state of constant agitation, moving pieces in the dark and firmly believing I was smarter than the kingdom's intelligence system. What I didn't know, and what today makes a shiver run down my spine just to remember, was that I had been monitored closely for months. Every conversation, every secret meeting, and every promise made in closed rooms had been recorded and taken directly to my brother and the senior princes. I had already lost the war before firing the first shot, and my arrogance wouldn't allow me to see the web being woven around me. The end of my life as a prince was about to happen brutally. One night in late 2019, I was summoned to a private meeting in one of the royal palaces in Riyadh. I thought it would be just another routine discussion about government affairs, something about contracts or military logistics, so I didn't hesitate to go. However, as soon as I crossed the heavy double wooden doors, I felt a weight in the air that made me stop for a second. The atmosphere was frigid, charged with a hostility I had never experienced in that place. I found my half-brother sitting at the head of a long table, surrounded by several senior princes and security officials whose faces looked carved in stone. There was no coffee, no customary warm greetings, only the cutting silence of someone who had already pronounced a death sentence. My stomach turned, and a cold sweat began to break out at the base of my neck, as I realized instantly that I was not there to debate, but to be confronted with my own political and personal ruin, without any chance of defense or escape from that trap. My half-brother wasted no time with pleasantries or diplomatic detours. He looked directly into my eyes, with a gaze that mixed contempt and absolute authority, and said he knew about every attempt of mine to gather support to challenge the succession. He placed folders on the table containing transcripts of my private conversations, photos of my secret meetings, and names of allies I believed were loyal to me. The sound of paper hitting the table echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. He accused me of treason against the family and the kingdom, crimes that would normally lead to life imprisonment or public execution. I heard those words and felt as if the blood were fleeing from my extremities, leaving me dizzy and breathless. He explained that only because we were of the same blood, because we shared the same father, he would not send me to the executioner immediately, but that the price for my life would be the total surrender of everything I knew and loved, turning me into a ghost outside the borders. The choice he gave me was a final blow to my dignity. I could accept permanent exile, leaving Saudi Arabia immediately to live in total anonymity abroad, or refuse and face formal charges that would result in my imprisonment and the public dishonor of my entire legacy. I felt a knot in my throat as I processed the destruction of years of planning and ambition in a matter of seconds. I wanted to scream. I wanted to argue that my vision was better for the country, but the faces around the table were impenetrable and cruel. I realized I had been a fool, underestimating the vigilance of those I intended to overthrow. With my heart beating wildly against my ribs and the bitter taste of defeat in my mouth, I swallowed my pride and accepted exile. It was the only way to preserve my physical life, although at that moment, I felt my soul was already being executed by the shame of having lost everything I considered important, leaving only emptiness. In less than 48 hours, I was inside a private jet flying over the desert, leaving behind my homeland with little more than a few suitcases and a limited amount of money that hadn't been frozen by the government. I was warned that I would be monitored constantly and that any attempt to return or speak publicly against the royal family would nullify the agreement, sealing my fate of immediate death. We landed in Amman, Jordan, a neighboring country, but to me, it felt like the end of the world. I walked through the airport feeling the weight of humiliation in every step. I, who was once surrounded by entourages and security, was now just a watched and unwanted man. I arrived at a rented apartment, far from palaces and marble, and sat in silence on the worn sofa, listening to the noise of the traffic outside that seemed to mock my fall. Anger against my brother burned like acid in my veins, and the feeling of having been robbed of what I thought I deserved began to drag me into an abyss of deep hatred and endless bitterness. The initial months in Amman were the darkest period of my entire life. I woke up every morning in that small rented apartment feeling as if there were a huge stone pressing down on my chest, making every breath a conscious and painful effort. The place looked nothing like the palaces where I grew up. It was a simple two-bedroom flat in a middle-class neighborhood, with basic furniture and white, peeling walls that looked more like the walls of a prison cell. I had gone from a man with dozens of servants attending to every wish to someone living in total solitude, cooking my own meals, when I bothered to eat, and cleaning my own space, something I rarely did. The contrast between my old life and that new reality was so extreme that sometimes I would stand in the middle of the room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I wasn't trapped in a nightmare from which I would eventually wake up. But every morning, upon opening my eyes and seeing the pale light hitting those lifeless walls, I was forced to accept that that was my world now, and there was no escape route. I spent most days lying on the sofa, submerged in a sickly silence, replaying the events that led to my exile over and over again until I felt I was going insane. The anger I felt for my half-brother consumed me like a forest fire that never goes out, fueled by the fuel of betrayal and lost power. I imagined violent confrontations where I shouted all the truths about his falsehood, and I spent hours researching news about the kingdom on the internet, torturing myself with videos of him giving speeches and being acclaimed. Every time I saw his face on my phone screen, I felt a wave of fury so intense that my hands shook, and I felt like breaking everything around me. But beneath that anger, there was a corrosive shame that acted like acid on my soul. I felt like a failure, a fool who tried to reach the sun and ended up crushed. The thought that everyone in Riyadh was laughing at me behind my back, calling me the fallen prince, was almost unbearable and kept me from wanting to leave the house or see anyone else. The loss of my identity was even more devastating than the loss of political power or riches. I no longer knew who I was without the title, without the entourage, and without the reverence of others. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger, a hollow shell of the man I used to be, with sunken eyes and no spark. I stopped shaving, letting the hair grow wild and unkempt, and I stopped exercising, watching my body weaken and gain weight due to inactivity and processed food. I spent days in the same sweatpants and a stained t-shirt, not caring about hygiene or appearance, because deep down I felt I was already dead inside. I was a spiritual homeless person, wandering through a dry and hopeless desert inside my own apartment. Prince Khalid had disappeared and, in his place, remained only a bitter, middle-aged man, without purpose and without a place in the world. This feeling of invisibility was a constant agony that made me want to disappear for good, as if I were a mistake that needed to be erased from history. The Islamic faith I practiced my whole life offered no comfort or help during this profound crisis. I tried to keep the prayer times, getting up before dawn for Fajr prayer, performing the ritual washings and prostrations I had done thousands of times, but everything felt mechanical and lifeless. I knelt on the mat facing Mecca and recited the Arabic words I memorized in childhood, but they felt like stones in my mouth, dry and heavy. I felt I was talking to the ceiling, sending words into an empty space where no one heard or cared about my pain. The Quran seemed harsh and demanding, full of rules and warnings about hellfire, without any trace of love or compassion that could touch my wound. The concept of a God who is just a distant master and we are mere slaves made me even more resentful. I felt I had followed the rules my whole life, done everything expected, and in the end, I was abandoned to my fate in a hole of despair. God seemed like a cold judge who had already condemned me to oblivion, and that made me give up trying to reach him. After about 6 months in this miserable existence, I began drinking alcohol regularly to numb the pain and silence the thoughts that tormented me day and night. I knew perfectly well that alcohol was haram, strictly forbidden in Islam, and that consuming it was a grave sin that could lead me to hell. But the truth is, I no longer cared about any of that. If God had abandoned me and left me to rot in this pit of despair, why should I continue to follow his rules? I started with beer and wine at night to be able to sleep, but quickly moved to much stronger drinks, like whiskey and vodka, which blacked me out faster. I drank until I passed out on the sofa and woke up in the middle of the night feeling sick and disoriented, only to drink more to make the nausea disappear for a moment. I knew I was destroying myself, but I welcomed that destruction with a sickly pleasure. It was the only thing in my life I felt I could still totally control. I also began using sleeping pills and anxiolytics that I bought at pharmacies without proper prescriptions, something that is strangely easy to get in Jordan if you have the right money. I mixed the pills with alcohol, knowing perfectly well that this combination was dangerous and often fatal, but deep down, that was exactly what I desired. A part of me actively hoped I would take an overdose and simply not wake up the next morning. It would be a silent end, a convenient accident that would free me from this unbearable emptiness. I had no friends in Amman because I had completely isolated myself from the world. I trusted no one and didn't want to hear the pity or judgment of strangers. The few acquaintances I made when I arrived stopped calling after I rejected their invitations time and again. I was submerged in a prison I had built myself, made of bitterness and self-pity, just waiting for the final darkness to finally claim me. On a night in March 2023, I reached my absolute limit. I gathered all the bottles of medication I had accumulated and spread them on the bathroom counter, counting each pill with a terrifying calmness. I knew that amount was enough to ensure I would never open my eyes again. I filled a glass with pure vodka to help swallow death and sat on the cold tile floor, leaning against the bathtub. Strangely, I felt a huge relief. The pain was about to end. But at the moment I was going to bring the first handful of pills to my mouth, I felt a sudden and overwhelming hesitation, as if an invisible hand were holding my arm. I began to cry uncontrollably, violent sobs that made my body shake. I threw the pills on the floor and screamed at the ceiling, challenging God with all the anger I had stored. If you are real, if you really exist and care about anyone, show me a reason to stay alive now. I screamed until my voice failed, before collapsing from exhaustion on the icy floor and falling into a deep sleep. What happened next defies all human logic. While my physical body lay inert on the bathroom floor, I suddenly felt I was being pulled out of my physical form. It was an indescribable sensation, as if I were sliding out of an old, heavy skin. Suddenly, I was near the ceiling, looking down and seeing my own body spread out on the tiles, surrounded by pills and the spilled glass of vodka. I felt no fear, just a strange peace and an immense curiosity. I began to rise, crossing the apartment ceiling and soaring above the city of Amman. I saw the lights below becoming tiny points of light, like inverted stars in the dark landscape, until everything became total darkness for a brief instant. When my vision returned, I was no longer in Jordan. I was in a vast and infinite space, filled with a golden and soft light that seemed to emanate from everywhere at the same time. It was a light that brought a comfort I had never felt in any palace. In that space of light, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was a man dressed in a robe of a white so bright it seemed to radiate its own luminosity, but it was a light I could look at without squinting. When our eyes met, I felt an electric shock of recognition, even though I had never seen him before. His eyes overflowed with a love I didn't know existed. It wasn't the conditional love of my family, which could be withdrawn if I failed, but a pure and absolute love that saw every dark secret of my soul and yet accepted me entirely. The warmth emanating from him seemed to melt the ice that had accumulated in my heart during all those years of exile and bitterness. I knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, that this was not a delusion caused by drugs or alcohol. It was more real than any palace marble. There, before him, all my importance as a prince disappeared, and I was just a man naked in his own truth, finally feeling seen. He began to speak to me in perfect classical Arabic, and his voice had a unique quality, being soft as a whisper and powerful as thunder at the same time. He said, "Khaled, I know your pain, I know your anger, and I know the emptiness that has consumed your entire existence until now." Hearing my name coming from that mouth was as if the entire universe were organizing itself. He continued explaining that I spent all my years seeking meaning in power, status, and the recognition of men, but that those things could never satisfy the deep hunger of my soul. He said he was the only one who could fill that black hole inside me, because he himself had created me and knew exactly what I needed. I felt every word piercing the layers of cynicism I had built as protection. There was no judgment in his tone, only a compassion so deep it made me realize how lost I was. For the first time, the authority before me was not based on fear or oppression. I fell to my knees before him, completely overwhelmed by his presence and by his words that seemed to read the script of my life. With a trembling voice, I asked who he was, although something very deep in my spirit already knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. He looked at me with infinite tenderness and replied, "I am Jesus, the Son of God, the way, the truth, and the life." He explained to me that he came to earth to die for my sins, so that I could be forgiven and reconciled with the Father. He said that everything they taught me about him was incomplete. He was not just a prophet or a good teacher, but God himself in human form who rose again to prove his power over death. He confessed to me that he was waiting for me to cry out to him because he loved me and had plans for me that I couldn't even imagine. In that instant, the foundation of everything I believed was shaken. The rigid religious structure in which I was raised collapsed before the living reality standing before my eyes. When he finished speaking, something broke definitively inside me, and I began to sob like a small child who finally finds the way home. All the arrogance, the hatred for my brother, and the bitterness of exile simply turned into tears I couldn't stop. I confessed that I wasted my whole life chasing shadows, that I hurt people, and that I only thought of myself, asking how he could love someone so broken and selfish as I. Jesus then knelt in front of me, coming down to my height, and placed his hands on my shoulders. At the moment he touched me, I felt a physical wave of love and acceptance run through every cell of my body. It was like being washed from the inside, as if all the dirt and the weight of my mistakes were being removed by that soft pressure. He told me that was exactly why he came, to seek and save what was lost, and to heal wounded hearts. I felt I no longer needed to pretend to be the perfect prince. I was loved by him. Jesus did something that shook me deeply. He raised his hands and showed me his wrists. I could clearly see the scars where the nails had pierced his flesh, real and painful marks of a sacrifice I could barely understand. He explained to me, with a calmness that cut through my soul, that he had taken the punishment I deserved. Every sin I committed, every selfish thought, every act of pride and rebellion that led me to that bathroom floor, he carried it all on the cross so that I could be free. He made it clear that it had nothing to do with my performance, my family name, or my supposed merits as a prince, but only with his sacrificial love for me. Seeing those marks made me understand for the first time what true love was, something that didn't need to be earned or bought with political influence. It was the surrender of a king for a rebellious servant, and that understanding destroyed the last defenses I still had against him. With tears running down my face, I said I believed in him and that I accepted his gift, surrendering my life to follow him. At the moment those words left my mouth, something physical happened in my chest. It was as if a gigantic burden I had carried for 53 years had been ripped from my shoulders and vanished into the air. The emptiness that haunted me since childhood, that black hole I tried to fill with power, alcohol, and pills, was filled by a warm, living, and real presence. I felt clean for the first time in my life, as if every dirty and shameful thing I did had been washed in a fountain of pure waters. A deep joy began to rise inside me, not a fleeting happiness of earthly achievements, but an unshakable peace of someone who knows they are accepted. I began to laugh and cry at the same time, feeling transformed. Jesus smiled at me with a tenderness that made me want to stay in that moment forever, never going back to the pain. However, Jesus' expression became more serious, and he told me that this new life came with a purpose that would cost me everything I had left. He led me through that space of golden light to what appeared to be an opening or window showing scenes of the world below. I saw my homeland, Saudi Arabia, from the vast sand dunes to the modern cities and the holy sites of Mecca and Medina. He asked me to look at my people and showed me how they were seeking the truth, hungry for love, but trapped in a religion of fear and uncertainty. I saw people praying 5 times a day without ever feeling heard, following rigid rules without ever feeling the peace of forgiveness. They were like sheep without a shepherd, desperately trying to please a God they felt was always distant and angry. Jesus' heart seemed to break for them, and I felt that same pain pulse inside me, a compassion I had never felt for anyone but myself in that overwhelming intensity. The scenes in the window began to change, and I saw something extraordinary happening in silence throughout the kingdom. I saw Saudis sleeping in their homes, and suddenly figures of light appearing in their rooms. It was Jesus himself visiting people in dreams and visions, speaking in Arabic, calling them by name and revealing his love. I saw a young woman in Riyadh waking up with her face bathed in tears, whispering the name of Isa al-Masih after a supernatural encounter. I saw a businessman in Jeddah have a vision during his afternoon prayer, where Jesus showed him he was the only way to the Father. I saw students and elders from all social classes having experiences they couldn't explain logically. Jesus explained to me that he was moving through Saudi Arabia with a power that no government or religious authority could stop, for he worked in the spiritual realm where human control has no reach. He was claiming the hearts of those created to know him, and that revelation left me in a state of total shock and wonder. Jesus looked directly at me and said, I hadn't been saved just for my own comfort, but that I had been chosen to be part of that unprecedented spiritual movement. He told me that I, who once was a prince of the house of Saud and sought earthly power through political maneuvers, would now become a voice for the kingdom of God. My position and my story were not accidental. Every detail of my life, even my painful exile, had been allowed to prepare me for that exact moment. He explained that I would speak to thousands of compatriots and that my testimony would confirm what he was already showing in dreams and visions across the desert. I felt a weight of responsibility mixed with an honor that no title of nobility ever provided me. I was no longer an heir to oil and land, but an ambassador of a truth that could set souls free. The idea that God would use someone as broken and ambitious as I for such a sacred task left me in a state of deep humility, making me realize that true power is not in ruling men, but in serving the King who rules eternity. Then, the window in front of us showed something that left me paralyzed with fear. I saw myself standing on a large stage before an immense crowd at a convention center in Riyadh. I was holding a microphone and declaring the name of Jesus publicly, while chaos broke out around me. Jesus warned me, with a seriousness that penetrated my bones, that fulfilling that mission would cost me everything I had left. He was clear in saying that I would lose my safety, any connection I still had with my royal family, and that most likely it would cost me my physical life. He asked me if I was willing to accept that fate, knowing the path would be one of suffering, persecution, and misunderstanding from those I loved most. Looking at that future scene, and hearing the warning of imminent death should have made me run, but the love emanating from him was so vast that the idea of following him seemed worth any price, no matter how high. The fear of death, which before led me to suicide out of despair, was now replaced by a calm courage, born of the certainty that I already belonged to something death could not touch. The answer came from my soul even before I processed the danger rationally. I said yes, that I was willing to go and do whatever he asked. I said that since he had saved my life when I had nothing left, my life now belonged totally to him, to be used according to his will. Jesus smiled at me with a tenderness that seemed to heal every emotional scar I still carried, and placed his hand on my head in a gesture of blessing and commissioning. I felt a warmth run through my entire being, a strength I knew didn't come from me, but would sustain me in the moments of darkness to come. He promised he would be with me every step of the way, that he would give me the right words to speak before the powerful, and that he would never abandon me, not even before the executioner. In that touch, I received not just a command, but the spiritual armor necessary to face what was to come on Saudi soil. The peace that flooded me at that moment was so solid that threats of exile and execution seemed only passing shadows before the eternal light now guiding my steps. Before sending me back, Jesus showed me one last vision to give me hope. I saw a Saudi Arabia in the future, where people worshipped God freely, without fear and without hiding. I saw churches meeting openly in cities like Riyadh and Jeddah, and the religious police no longer existed to oppress faith. I saw a profound cultural transformation, where thousands of Saudis found peace and purpose in Christ, and the nation was healed of its spiritual rigidity. Jesus declared that he was taking control of that nation, not by military or political conquest, but by the irresistible power of love and truth that penetrates hearts. He assured me that this change wouldn't happen in 100 years, but would begin to manifest during my lifetime, and that I would be one of the voices to announce this new era. That image of spiritual freedom and joy in my country was the last thing I saw before feeling I was being pulled back to physical reality. The desert was about to bloom in a way no one could imagine, and I took with me the promise that light would conquer darkness in the land of my ancestors. The transition back to my physical body was violent and painful, as if I were being squeezed through a narrow, cold crack. I opened my eyes suddenly, and the first thing I felt was the ice of the bathroom tiles against my cheek, and the pungent smell of spilled vodka impregnating the air. The contrast between the golden light I had just left and the dirty gloom of that apartment in Amman was almost unbearable, making me sob with an immediate and deep longing. I got up with difficulty, feeling my limbs heavy and my heart beating like an uneven drum, but the depression that had crushed me hours before had completely vanished, replaced by a clarity of purpose I had never known. I cleaned the floor with trembling hands, threw away every pill that remained, and poured the rest of the drink down the drain, feeling I was burying the man I used to be right there. I was weak, with my legs shaking, but inside me burned an ember that the whole world could not extinguish. I was a new creature, and my homeland was waiting for me to hear the truth. The months that followed were an intense and dangerous preparation, lived in the shadows of Amman, while I planned my clandestine return to Saudi Arabia. Through contacts I still had in the business world and heavy bribes to border officials, I obtained a fake passport in the name of Abdullah al-Rashid, presenting myself as a Kuwaiti investor. Fear was a constant shadow, but the voice of Jesus in my mind was stronger than any threat of execution for treason. When the plane landed in Riyadh on that dry January morning, the hot, dusty desert air seemed to welcome me to a mission of death or spiritual glory. I walked through the airport with my heart in my mouth, avoiding the gaze of the guards who once greeted me with reverence, feeling the weight of that land on my shoulders. I was no longer the exiled prince seeking revenge. I was an intruder in my own kingdom, carrying a message that would shake golden thrones. Every step toward the convention center felt like walking toward my own sacrifice, but the peace I felt was as solid as the rocks of Hejaz. On January 15, 2024, I entered the Riyadh International Convention Center mixed among 10,000 businessmen and officials, feeling the electricity of the moment run down my spine. When the keynote speaker had that sudden collapse on stage and chaos broke out, I knew the way was opened by invisible hands. I climbed the wooden steps, grabbed the metal microphone, and smelled the scent of sweat and incense lingering in the crowded auditorium as the cameras focused on my face. At the moment, I declared myself to be Prince Khalid and announced that Jesus Christ was the Son of God. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard in my life, a vacuum of shock that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room. I saw the security guards jumping toward me, but before they touched me, I saw the miracle. People standing up shouting, "I saw him too. He appeared to me in dreams." It was a supernatural explosion that no police force could contain. The truth was loose in the heart of the kingdom, and the spiritual fire Jesus had promised was consuming the farce of that room before my eyes. What happened after that morning is a mystery that even I cannot fully explain, for time seemed to fragment. I remember the violent pressure of handcuffs on my wrists, the sound of heavy boots running across marble, and being dragged down a dark corridor, while shouts of confession of faith still echoed off the auditorium walls like thunder. I was taken to a place that doesn't appear on maps, an underground cell where silence is the only companion and where sunlight never reaches. I was interrogated by men whose names I will never know, and threatened with shadows that would make any ordinary man tremble, but my peace remained intact, like a permanent mark on my soul that no one can erase. Suddenly, my story simply ceases for the outside world. I became a ghost, a hallway whisper, a legend running through the phones of millions of Saudis in secret. The experience happened, the fire was lit, and as abruptly as it began, my physical presence disappeared from the map, leaving only the scar of truth. To this day, I do not know where my body ends and the eternal begins. But I know the mark is real and that nothing will ever be as it was before.
This story proves that no throne on earth is greater than the truth that sets the soul free. If a prince was able to give up everything for a real encounter with Jesus, what stops you from living the extraordinary today? I want to know your opinion. Have you ever felt that something bigger was calling you? Leave your comment below and share your experience with us. To continue receiving transforming content like this, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. This is essential so you don't miss any of these stories that impact the world. Now don't stop here. Click on the next video appearing on the screen to continue this journey of faith. Until next time, and may God bless you.